The story begins with the tense moment when Japan officially declared war against the United States. The U.S. Army had no choice but to respond, sending out several planes to launch aerial attacks. Among them was one plane carrying 3 soldiers, a pilot and his 2 assistants, Tony and Jean. Coordinating with each other, they pressed forward toward Japanese territory, but first they had to cross the vast Pacific Ocean. None of them realized just how dangerous the Pacific could be. As they advanced, the pilot noticed ominous black clouds forming, an unusual sight that made him uneasy despite his experience from many past missions. The situation grew worse when he saw their fuel level had dropped to less than half, far too low to cover the long distance ahead. He quickly asked Jean to contact the military base for instructions, but the radio was full of interference. When a signal finally came through, it wasn't the U.S. Army, it was Japanese soldiers. If the Japanese discovered American troops advancing toward their territory, they would certainly launch a deadly attack. Jean immediately cut the connection and switched to Morse code for secret communication, but even then, no contact could be established. Fuel was running dangerously low, and a massive storm appeared to be approaching. The pilot had no choice but to tell his crew they might have to land on water. Tony and Jean were terrified at the idea since they had never spent time in the open Pacific, and rescue could take forever. Still, the pilot ordered them to gather all resources into one bag. Moments later, with fuel nearly gone, he brought the plane down onto the ocean. The impact badly damaged the aircraft, which began to sink quickly, likely due to an unnoticed hole. The pilot and Tony managed to unbuckle and swim upward, but Jean got stuck and was dragged down with the plane until the very last moment when he freed himself and followed his comrades to the surface. The 3 climbed into a small lifeboat, only to realize their supplies had gone down with the plane. Now stranded in the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean with no resources, no contact with command, and the threat of Japanese forces potentially spotting them, the soldiers were left with only one option: survive against all odds. As far as they could see, there was no island and not a single boat in sight. The question now was, how could they possibly escape this situation? Suddenly, the 3 soldiers spotted a plane in the sky, a U.S. military aircraft. Desperately, they waved and shouted, trying to get its attention, but of course, the plane was far too distant to hear them. They needed to do something noticeable to attract the crew's attention. This was a critical moment. If the plane passed without noticing them, they would be stranded indefinitely. In such situations, the simplest survival tactic is to spread clothes or belongings on the water's surface, creating a visible anomaly that rescuers might recognize. Without flares or signaling devices, survivors can also use goggles or mirrors to reflect sunlight, a method proven to be visible from great distances. If that fails, scattering body vests around the raft might catch attention. But these soldiers had none of those tools. The pilot lamented that if they'd had parachutes, they could have spread them out over the water, but those too had sunk with the plane. Helplessly, they watched as the aircraft disappeared into the distance. Their last chance to be seen was gone. The mood on the raft grew heavy. The pilot knew the grim truth: they were badly trapped, and rescue might never come back for them. Tony and Jean were stunned, refusing to believe that the U.S. military would abandon them, but the pilot explained that the searchers had already left and were unlikely to return. Their one shot at signaling had failed, and now they had no idea how many days they would be left adrift. Morale began to collapse. The raft itself was small, barely enough for 2 men, and the pilot feared that if it deflated, they'd be doomed. Still, until that happened, they had to keep moving. With some survival knowledge, the pilot ordered Tony and Jean to remove their shoes and throw them overboard to lighten the raft for a long journey. Trusting their senior, they obeyed, only to realize later that the pilot hadn't thrown away his own shoes. When confronted, he explained calmly that if they ever reached land, someone would need footwear to explore. Tony and Jean accepted the reasoning, but unease settled in. The pilot clearly knew more than them, and if he decided to abandon them, what chance would they have? As hours passed and night fell, the 3 grew unbearably thirsty. They knew they couldn't drink seawater, it would only make them sicker. But the pilot, refusing to wait any longer, resorted to a grim survival tactic. He urinated into a shoe and drank it. Tony and Jean were disgusted, horrified that someone could do such a thing, but the pilot reminded them that to quench thirst in desperate conditions, one had to make hard choices. That night, they took turns resting on the cramped raft, with only one man able to sleep at a time while the other 2 kept watch. None of them knew how long this could continue, or if they'd ever be rescued at all. By morning, after studying the currents, the pilot suggested the waves seemed to be pushing them toward Hawaii, while behind them lay a remote and undeveloped part of America. The pilot estimated that if they kept drifting for a few more days, the currents might carry them toward Hawaii. But Jean raised the obvious concern: how could they survive that long without food or water? They were in the Pacific Ocean, infamous for its violent storms and record-breaking waves. If such conditions hit them, survival would be nearly impossible. For now, hunger gnawed at them. It had been days since they'd eaten. Jean pointed out that the ocean had fish, and if they could catch some, they might have a chance. The three improvised a hook by dismantling a spring from a magazine. They tied it to a makeshift line and cast it into the water. Soon something tugged hard on it, but whatever was down there pulled with incredible force. Jean and Tony struggled to reel it in, desperate for food, but the line snapped. Shocked, they realized just how difficult catching fish would be here, and that something powerful lurked beneath them. As the sun blazed overhead, the heat became unbearable. Frustrated, Jean leapt into the water for relief, enjoying the coolness on his body. Seeing him, Tony prepared to do the same, but the pilot stopped him, warning that sharks were common in the Pacific. Hearing that, Jean panicked and scrambled back into the raft. The danger was clear, they couldn't safely enter the water, and they couldn't catch food either. Threats surrounded them on all sides. A full week passed with the three stranded soldiers drifting in the middle of the ocean, their bodies growing weaker by the day. Sunburn covered their skin with angry red blotches. They couldn't fish, couldn't swim, and had no supplies. Worst of all, no rescue seemed to be coming. That's when the truth became clear. Back when their plane had first lost radio contact, the pilot had accidentally taken a wrong turn. By the time communication was re-established, they had already drifted far off course, with no fuel left to correct their path. One mistake, and now all their lives were at risk in the middle of a vast, empty ocean. Tony grew so weak he considered drinking seawater just to fill his stomach. He scooped some up, but the pilot stopped him. Yes, it might ease his thirst briefly, but the salt would ravage his body, leading to dehydration and worse. Reluctantly, Tony listened, but their options were running out. Death felt inevitable. The pilot, the eldest among them, blamed himself for the situation. Even though it wasn't truly his fault, it was bad luck. Still, guilt weighed on him. Lost in thought, he reached into his pocket and, to his surprise, pulled out a pencil. Suddenly, hope flickered in his eyes. Tony and Jean were confused. What use was a pencil in the middle of the ocean? The pilot explained, with it, they could try to sketch a map and chart a course. The pilot decided they would begin mapping every detail they noticed, sketching it directly onto a life jacket with his pencil. Thanks to his training, he already understood directions and constellations, so he began carefully tracking their course. Before long, he managed to figure out the direction they were drifting in, and more importantly, the direction they actually needed to go. He explained that the raft was being carried wherever the winds blew, but their survival depended on moving against it. To steady the boat, he tied it down and let it drag in the water, acting like an anchor to hold their position until conditions shifted. It was a clever trick, just like how massive ships use anchors to stop drifting. The three of them realized that their coordination was their greatest weapon, and they began to pray for deliverance. Jean begged to live, thinking about the family he longed to return to once the war was over. The pilot prayed too, promising that if they survived, they would make everything right. But Tony asked for only one thing: rain. His thirst was unbearable, his body burning from the sun. If rain fell, they might finally survive. He looked skyward in disappointment. No clouds, no storm, no answer from God. Still, deep down, they all knew prayers weren't instant solutions. Maybe this was a test of faith, a test of endurance. That faint hope was the only thing keeping them alive. Without survival knowledge or mental strength, most men would have given up days ago. But for these three, worse challenges still lay ahead. Night fell again, with nothing but water and darkness around them. They sat silently, bracing themselves. Then, like a miracle, raindrops began to fall. It poured from the heavens, and the soldiers rejoiced. For the first time in days, they drank fresh water, greedily collecting as much as they could in every container they had. Their bodies soaked, their thirst finally quenched, their spirits lifted. It felt as though God himself had answered their pleas. By morning, Jean returned to his obsession, fishing. He had spent an entire week trying and failing, yet he refused to give up. The pilot told him it was pointless without a proper hook, but Jean was stubborn. He wasn't about to starve without a fight. Hunger can drive even the toughest men to desperation, and Jean's patience had snapped. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a knife. Opening it, he announced he would spear a fish directly. The pilot grew nervous, warning him to put it away. One wrong move could puncture the raft, and if air escaped, they'd all drown. But Jean, driven by hunger, ignored him. Leaning over the side, he stabbed at the water again and again. Suddenly, the knife struck something solid. Terrified, Jean gasped, believing he had stabbed the raft itself. If he pulled it back, the raft might collapse. But then came the shocking truth: he hadn't pierced the raft at all. The blade had struck a small shark. Jean quickly hauled the baby shark onto the raft, and together they killed it before it could strike back with its razor-sharp teeth. To survive, Tony and Jean sliced open its belly, finding several small fish inside, which they eagerly devoured. For the first time in days, they had something besides water in their stomachs, nutrition that gave them a renewed sense of strength. Still, a new fear weighed heavily on them. If the rest of the shark's family caught the scent of blood, they would surely attack. For now, though, the three men ate without worry, grateful to have food secured for the coming days. The pilot, feeling hopeful again, shared that he wanted nothing more than to return to his family as soon as they escaped. Curious, he asked the others about their loved ones. Tony admitted he had a girlfriend, the most beautiful girl, whom he longed to see again. Poor Jean, on the other hand, revealed he had no one, an orphan who had always been alone. Hearing this, Tony smiled and told him to come meet his sister someday, promising she was kind and beautiful enough to steal his heart. That moment of bonding gave them courage, reminding them they were no longer strangers but brothers in survival. But danger returned quickly. Soon, they noticed a swarm of sharks circling beneath the raft. The scent of blood from the baby shark had drawn them in. Dozens swam menacingly around, yet by sheer luck, they eventually drifted away without attacking. The men breathed easier and settled into uneasy rest. That night, disaster nearly struck again. Jean, half asleep, let his hand dangle into the water. A shark lunged and bit him. By miracle, it didn't drag him under, but the wound was deep and agonizing. Tony and the pilot tended to him, and though the injury wasn't fatal, it weakened him badly. Time dragged on, days blending into nights. Weakened and hallucinating from hunger, Jean once thought he spotted an island, but it was only an illusion. His mind, clouded by pain and exhaustion, was betraying him. The others realized his condition was growing worse. Meanwhile, Tony, losing hope, clutched his pistol and stared at it for hours, as if contemplating suicide. But before he could act, Jean silently asked for the gun. Raising it without warning, he aimed, not at the pilot, but at a bird perched on the raft. One shot, and the bird fell dead into the sea. The pilot leapt in to grab it, unaware a shark was lurking behind him. His comrades shouted desperately, and he swam for his life, barely scrambling back onto the raft before the predator struck. Luck favored them again, and now they had meat to last a little longer. Still, the question loomed, how long could they survive like this? Their bodies were weakening fast, and despair was creeping in. The pilot awoke one morning furious to find both Tony and Jean asleep, no one standing watch as planned. Reckless mistakes could cost them their lives. He shouted at them, his frustration boiling over. Stung by his harsh words, Jean snapped back, blaming the pilot for everything. If he had been more careful flying the plane, they never would have crashed. Worse, Jean accused him of lying. After all his promises, no island had appeared. The pilot froze at the accusation, guilt clawing at his conscience. He remembered, with dread, that moment at the controls, when exhaustion overtook him, and he had closed his eyes, even for just a moment. For just a moment the pilot had dozed off, and in that brief lapse the plane had drifted off course, carrying the entire crew far from where they were supposed to be. The pilot had carried his guilt in silence for weeks, burying the truth beneath a hardened exterior. He knew that if he admitted the mistake, if he told them that he had closed his eyes for just a few minutes during the flight, the weight of all their suffering would crash down on him alone. So instead, he urged them forward with whatever scraps of navigation knowledge they still possessed, as if sheer determination could undo what had already been done. Jean, his skin blistered from the relentless sun, pulled out the rough map he had scrawled earlier onto the surface of a life jacket. His voice was weak but steady. Let's follow this. If we keep to the marks I made, maybe it will lead us to an island, maybe to survival. His words were the only thread of hope left in the void of the Pacific. The pilot, driven by desperation, tore apart one of his shoes and ripped the sole free. He shaped it into a crude paddle and began pushing at the water. The rhythm was clumsy, the strokes uneven, but it gave their raft the faintest hint of forward motion. Even then, none of them could be sure if they were moving closer to salvation or deeper into oblivion. The ocean had no signposts, no boundaries, only horizon upon horizon, endless and mocking. Then came the rain. At first, just a mist on the horizon, then a sudden downpour that pelted their cracked skin like cold needles. The three men tilted their heads back, mouths open to the sky, drinking greedily. They cupped their hands, filled helmets and torn cloth, storing every precious drop they could. For a short while, it felt like a blessing, a gift from heaven, washing away the salt from their lips and cooling their fevered bodies. But peace on the Pacific never lasted. As the sky darkened, the pilot's eyes fixed on the distance, and dread stiffened his voice. A storm was coming. Not the gentle kind that brought water, but a monstrous wall of black clouds advancing toward them like an army. Each second felt like it would be their last. And yet, against all odds, the storm passed. The fury of the ocean softened back into swells, and the men, trembling and numb, managed to right the raft and crawl back aboard. They lay in silence, too weak to speak, too broken to weep. Their bodies felt like husks, drained of warmth, strength, and hope. Hallucinations crept into their minds, phantom lights on the horizon, phantom voices calling from the waves. At last, the pilot could bear it no longer. He confessed, his voice cracking with shame. He told them everything, that it had been his moment of sleep, his fatal lapse of judgment, that had set them adrift in this endless ocean. At another time, Tony and Jean might have raged at him, might have demanded answers, but not now. Now they had no energy left for anger. Their lips were cracked, their faces hollow. Words would only waste breath, and breath was survival. The little food they had managed to save was gone, washed away in the storm. Their bodies had wasted away to little more than skin and bone, each movement sending sparks of pain through their fragile frames. Yet Tony would not let despair be their last act. "We've come too far to die out here," he insisted. Summoning what little willpower he had left, Tony plunged his hands into the ocean and began striking the surface, pushing against it with bare palms as if he could coax the raft forward by sheer force. The gesture was pitifully small against the vast Pacific, but Jean and the pilot joined him, each slap of water echoing the rhythm of survival. The raft groaned and shifted, inching forward in stubborn defiance of hopelessness. Then the pilot's voice broke the silence, weak but oddly distant. "I see something, green, out there. It's calling to us." His eyes were glazed, unfocused. Tony and Jean exchanged a weary glance. They had seen this before, the fever dreams, the mirages of land, food, or family that dissolved into nothing but waves. This was just another cruel trick of the mind. But even the strongest of them had reached his breaking point. The pilot, once their anchor, the man who had kept them steady through storms and silence, finally lowered his head and scooped seawater into his mouth. He drank greedily, knowing it would poison him, knowing it meant surrender. Salt water was death, but he no longer cared. It was his way of saying goodbye. Then came a cry, faint but sharp, tearing through the air like a spark in darkness. Jean, trembling violently, lifted a shaking arm and pointed. "Look," he rasped, his voice raw. There really is something green." At first, Tony thought it was another delusion. But then his blurred vision cleared just enough, and his heart lurched in his chest. Through the shimmer of the horizon, beyond the broken swells, a patch of color broke the monotony of blue. Green. Leaves. Trees. Land. Suddenly, exhaustion melted into adrenaline. Their limbs, moments ago lifeless, were infused with desperate energy. With the last fragments of strength left in their starved bodies, the three men paddled, clawed, and shoved the raft toward the promise of salvation. Inch by agonizing inch, the island grew larger, more solid, more undeniable. At last, the raft scraped against sand. They spilled onto the beach like broken shells, collapsing face-first into the earth. The feeling of solid ground beneath them was overwhelming, rough, warm, alive. After more than a month adrift on the endless ocean, they clung to the sand as though it were the embrace of the earth itself. When they finally lifted their heads, two small huts stood at the edge of the tree line. Smoke curled faintly from one of them, a sign of life, a sign of people. The sight filled them with a quiet, trembling hope. They would not die nameless in the middle of the Pacific. They might yet be rescued. And so their ordeal came to an end. This was no tale of fiction, no sailor's myth. During World War II, real U.S. military soldiers endured exactly such a nightmare, stranded for weeks on the unforgiving Pacific, surviving storms, starvation, and hallucinations until at last stumbling upon land. Against impossible odds, they endured. And against those same odds, they lived.